Good day to my Music 110 class. This is going to be a little bit different. We had finished lesson 3, a lot of you have, and I'm going to skip lessons 4 and 5 because we're in an 8-week class. And in the 8-week class, sometimes I have had to really rush and cram stuff in. So I'm going to skip 2 lessons that deal with what I used to call some of the boring stuff. It's some theory stuff that it's not terrible, but I wanted to get to some of the historical aspects. And so in order to get all of this in an 8-week class, some things get dropped to the wayside. And I'm going to be jumping to lesson 6. So if you see some material in the course material section that says lesson 3 and then suddenly it's lesson 6, don't panic. We're doing this on purpose. Now, here's the other thing that may sort of make you crazy. I'm going to combine 2 historical periods to begin with. The Renaissance is almost 1,000 years, but within that 1,000 years, there's only a few really significant musical things that occur. What's more significant is probably the historical aspect that led to these musical events. So I'm going to spend some time on that. And then we're going to go right into the Renaissance, which is an extremely important period for musical development, for the arts in general. So I'm giving you a bit of a warning. You're going to see a lot of information, and I don't want you to skip over it because it is important. For instance, the Middle Ages PowerPoint. If you'll open that up and follow along with me, you'll see that I spend a good bit of time on the I guess you say, the precursor to the period and talking about the Roman Empire. But it's because of the Roman Empire that we have what we have going on in the rest of the Middle Ages. Musically, it's somewhat of a stagnant period. The clock moves slow, let's put it that way, because you go for roughly 400 AD all the way to around the 13th century or 12th century. And in that period, you have very slow changes in music. Now, the reason for that, as you will see, is because of the influence of the church. The church was on a ready for Jesus to return mode still. And in the process, it was trying to control the world to maintain, or I guess I should say, edit out sin. Like a lot of things, the church made the mistake of thinking if they could hamper sin, they could control sin, which in fact is sort of like telling you not to think of the word hippopotamus. You automatically think of it. There was as much sin and greed and graft and all kinds of stuff. But on the surface, they tried to present a world that was a godly world. And so music, but don't let me get ahead of myself. Open the PowerPoint. The first thing you'll see is the dates in the Middle Ages, 450 to 1450. And then a nice picture. I give you a graph of the Roman Empire. The reason I do this, I want you to realize that the world that the Western world knew at the time was the Roman Empire. And I'm looking at it right now, and you'll see that it engulfs about half of Europe, part of North Africa, and some of the Middle East, and all of Spain, and most of Great Britain. That was the Roman world, and it had great influence. Roads and everything, trade, travel, even language was pretty much controlled by the Romans. So this is good and bad. We know that the Romans did some terrible things, atrocious things, killing people, enslaving people, but what allowed them to do it was they built roads, they set up outposts, they had legions and cohorts all over the place bringing what they call the Pax Romana, which is the peace of Rome. The Pax Romana, though, had a dark side because the peace of Rome was that if you break the law, we kill you. It's not a matter of paying a fine, which they like to do, but to control things, they literally would kill people. For instance, if a Roman citizen were killed on a Roman road, they would go to the nearest town and say, who did it? And if nobody confessed, they said, bring us the guy who killed this Roman, or we'll come back and kill the whole town. Now that's a real good motivation for either finding the criminal or giving somebody up you don't like. But Rome was brutal. And in that brutality, they did have a sense of peace. I have a picture of the city of Rome, and you see that it was very sophisticated, very architecturally well built, and a lot of innovations. And usually I spend a long time talking about these, but I want to skip over some of this to get to the music part. The next slide shows how Rome did this, and it was their army. And their army was one of the best trained fighting armies in the world at the time. Now, they had their problems. With the Eastern Empire, the Parthians, Scythians gave them trouble. In the north, the Germanians gave them trouble. And they just skipped over the Celts and the Picts up in northern Scotland, northern Great Britain, because they're just too wild. They didn't venture far into North Africa. They were smart. They picked their fights and they fought their fights. If they didn't think they could win it, they would bribe someone. Have some more pictures of Rome. Then I come to a picture, or a slide, pardon me, of the Gladiator. And what that symbolizes is how Rome began to sort of, I guess you say, degrade itself or rot from the inside. The people of Rome were lazy. They got lazy. Before, they were fighters, they were soldiers, they were warlike, but now they had their children that they loved and wanted to spend time with their kids, so they hired mercenaries. This will be their ultimate undoing, because eventually they'll hire the same barbarians they defeated in battle. And when the army is made up of barbarians, pretty soon they say, hey, we've been trained, we've been well armed, let's go take Rome like we planned to do a couple of centuries ago. But it wasn't just cut and dried, as like some historians like to make it. This took quite a bit of time. In the process, and I've got a picture of Roman ruins, you'll see all that. But there was a division in Rome. You had the Eastern Empire, which was located in Byzantium, what today is Constantinople, named after Constantine, by the way. And then you had the Roman Western Empire in Rome. And they struggled to see who was most powerful. We always think of Rome, but actually the Byzantium Empire of Constantinople was more powerful and richer because it set on trade routes. In a battle, and the legend says that around 300, 306 or something like that, Constantine, who by the way was Greek, he was losing a battle, and he said, well, did we sacrifice to all the gods? They said, well, everybody but the Christian God. He said, do it. They made sacrifice to the Christian God. The battle turned their way. They won. Constantine gave credit to the Christian God. And subsequently, he became Christian, or he said he did. He made his army march under a cross and said, now you guys are Christian. And they became the first Roman Christian empire. From that, a lot of cool things happened. Like his mother decided she was going to go to Israel or Palestine and pick out where everything happened. So if you ever go to Israel on a biblical tour, realize that everywhere you go is somewhere she decided was what happened. She went and she said, well, here's Golgotha, here's where he's crucified, here's where he's buried, and there's a church that covers both those places. You go over to Mount of Olives, she said, here's where he ascended, here's where the disciples met. And she just made up her mind that she was going to locate and name all those places, and they became tradition. So some of those places may or may not be where things happen. But anyway, you had a Roman influence or a Christian influence in Western Empire. Oh, pardon me, I'm talking too fast. In the Eastern Empire, Rome. Back over in the Western Empire, they had stretched themselves out, and by the 4th century, they were getting weaker. The Goths had invaded and taken over, and then they left, but they were still being threatened by various barbaric tribes. One will be a guy named Attila the Hun. And so they decided that Christianity was working pretty well for Byzantium and Constantinople, and they thought, well, let's allow it. So they allowed Christianity. In the Eastern Empire, it became the state religion, and the Western Empire became one of many religions, but they stopped the persecution. And then something happened, and you'll see that, I think it's slide 10, Christianity comes to Rome. I point this up because this is a turning point for culture, and it includes music and the arts. And the story there, you can read it for yourself, but I'm just going to give you the quick version, is the Emperor Valentinian sent Pope Leo I, who wasn't a pope at the time, and one of the councils, Venius, He was the prefect of Rome. They sent them out to meet Attila and his army because Attila the Hun had wiped out legions, was on his way to destroy Rome. They sent these guys out because the Roman city only had the one cohort or so, about 6,000 men, I think. I don't know if it's that many to defend Rome. Attila had this huge army, and he was just wading through people. So they send them out to see if they can work a treaty out. They get there, and the people didn't want to go talk to him. They got scared, so they sent Pope Leo out, or Bishop Leo. It's one of those historical moments where something happened, we don't know what it was. Leo and Attila sat down and they talked. Not sure how long, some people say an hour or 2 hours, but something was said that convinced Attila to turn around and go home. He turned his army around, he went back to the north, he ran into some Roman legions and fought them, but it's unexplainable why he didn't go ahead and destroy Rome. Eventually, Attila will die, either murdered by a wife or maybe his feuding sons, and then they struggled for power and sort of split the Huns up, and so they ceased to be a threat. So everything worked out good for Rome. Leo comes back, and the council of Ennius there and the prefect, or the prefect there, he says, well, it wasn't us, it was this guy. And they gave Leo credit. Well, the people were very thankful. And what does Leo say? He said, don't thank me, thank God. And so this made the Romans think that the Christian God was more powerful. I mean, they had Constantinople over there, and it was doing great. So they decided, hey, let's accept Christianity as our state religion. And that was the beginning. When it began, things changed rapidly and drastically. Leo said, well, to be a Christian nation, we need to get rid of some things, like all this crazy murder and killing and rape and incest and stuff like that. We need to change our way of living. No bacchanals, no wild parties. And he changed the music. He said, well, the music should be praising God. Instead of going around singing these debauchery songs, praise God. And by the way, we need to get rid of these other religions because they're false. Well, that was hard for some, but some people thought, no, this God is powerful. So they got rid of just about all the other religions. Leo chose the temple of Dagon, the fish god, to be the first house of the Christian church. And in doing so, a little trivia, he chose to keep the staff of Dagon, which was a fish, and that's a symbol of Christianity anyway. They use secretly the symbol of the fish, and so he kept the staff. And even today, one of the popes always get to choose what staff they carry. And one of the recent popes chose that ancient staff to carry. And people got all upset. And they say, oh, the Pope's carrying a pagan staff. No big deal. But anyway, things began to change around the 4th century. Now, we say that Rome fell at this time, which it did in a way. There was the Goths and I'm trying to remember the other group. Anyway, they were mercenaries. They came in, they took it over. They sacked Rome for 3 days and then they left. So Rome essentially loses its position and status. It still has legions. It still has men stationed out into the frontier. But what you see is this slow evolving into what was the Roman Empire becomes just the countries and tribal areas. And the Romans who are there, they've got soldiers, weapons, and they begin to control these areas in small pockets. And you have the precursor to what we will call the age of lords and knights. These knights are Roman soldiers who have the power. And it becomes the people who have the power are the people who control things. Meanwhile, in the East, you still have Byzantium, which is going great. I come to a slide and it says the historical highlights of the Middle Ages. And I point to the collapse of Roman power and the rise of the church around 450. This is what's called the beginning of the medieval age. And it's all called the Dark Ages, the time of migration, the age of faith, the age of chivalry, because all those things are happening at the same time. Medieval, people get confused. They go, what is it called medieval? It's because according to the church, it was between two evil times. Prior to the Christian church, it was controlling, it was evil. And after the Renaissance, The Renaissance is looked upon as a great jump forward for humanity, but it was evil to the church because the church lost a lot of power. So in the middle of that evil time is this roughly 1,000-year reign of the church. The Dark Ages, simply because it was rather chaotic and everything was controlled by power and sword. The time of migration, Rome falling, there were 4 million slaves in Rome alone. And so a lot of those people went home. Now you got 4 million people on the move. And, that's a huge migration. The Age of Faith, well, the church was in control. And the Age of Chivalry, at the latter part, you had the good knights and the bad knights. And we have this whole idea of knights in shining armor and things like that. Not quite as romantic as, let's say, some of the later writers put it. I mention the Age of Faith, though, again, because it's during this time that the church controls education, they control architecture, all art and music. Education, because they're the only ones that can read just about, and they teach the young nobles. And they send out missionaries into the European areas of Spain, France, and Gaul, or France and Gaul, the same, Britain, Germany, and they're spreading the gospel, not necessarily the Roman way, but in the process, they're educating the chief's children. The Roman soldiers that are there now consider themselves lords of the land, so they educate them. On that list, I mentioned the Crusades, the 100 Years' War, and finally the bubonic plague. And those are the last 3 major events that occurred. I like to see nothing much to do with music there, but we'll talk some about that. I mentioned the Crusades. I'll talk about the musical characteristics next. And you will hear the word chant and things like that. I give you an example of chant music. You ought to listen to it if you're not familiar with it. And I also give you an example of some of the musical instruments, I should say, that were popular. In the beginning, instruments were not accepted at all, but they began to make a slow and progressive sneak into the system, where by the end of the age, they've got full-blown instrumental ensembles. And I have a video for you to listen to about bowed instruments and also about how they're played. Then I give you a section on the illuminated text. These are just visuals, but I want to just see that everything, by the way, in the Middle Ages is handwritten, hand-printed. And a lot of people couldn't read, so they would draw pictures and paintings in the music so that even if they couldn't read, they could be reminded of what it's talking about. And I show you an illuminated text. It's called illuminated because it does have pictures to tell the story. And you will notice that the music is written on stabs. Originally, it was written on one line, and they just put lines above and below to show a relative highness or relative lowness, not specific notes. A guy named Gregory in the 6th century, Pope Gregory, he says, we need something better. We need, so that if we sing Alleluia here and they sing in another city, it's going to sound the same. And so he came up with a better way of notation. And because of that, they didn't, how do I put this? The priests who were writing these chants, they weren't trying to be prideful and take credit. So rather than the priest who wrote it taking credit, they gave credit to Pope Gregory. That is why we have Gregorian Chant. All music that was written, vocal music, I should say, for almost 6 centuries was called Gregorian Chant. We don't know who really wrote it. They credited Gregory with it. But he came up with this notation system. He used things like stuff called neumes and that sort of thing. And I have a couple other slides showing you the beauty of the music as it was written down. We talk about sacred music. All composers were monks or priests. I use the term plain song because plain song deals with chant, which it's pretty literal. It is just a plain song, one line of music, no harmony, nothing else. The idea of harmony will come in later when they add one note playing. It's called a drone. So if you play one note and then sing with it, every now and then you will hit harmony, but also every now and then you'll hit some rather discordant stuff. I give you the characteristics of chant. It was modal, and this is how we know how chant or how the Greek sounds were See, before this, there was nothing written. So whatever the Greeks used or the Romans, we didn't know how it really sounded. But the Roman Church adapted the mode system of the Greeks, which is like a scale. But because they did, now we know how the Greek music sounded. We have a better idea. All we have to do is figure out what mode somebody was singing. And there's 6 general modes. And we could basically tell how it sounded. It's sort of like reverse engineering something. But they did use those modes. They only used 3 effectively. But anyway, that was the early scales. Then all the music is vocal. All the music is monophonic. Monophonic being a single melodic line, no harmony. And acapella. And we've talked about the word acapella, but basically we use it to say there was no accompaniment. And then you have, it's all liturgical. What that means, it was used for religious services. It's not to say that there wasn't other music. It's just there was no other music allowed to be printed. And literally, they frowned on if you were singing. I mean, imagine you're out in the field, you're working, you're singing a work song, the priest come by. Well, you stop, because they could tell you, say, hey, that's sinful. Anything not sacred became sinful. And that was one of the sort of problems that made this whole period sort of historically static. I talk a little bit more about the Gregorian Chant, which I've already talked about. 2 terms on this slide, which is, by the way, slide 20, I think. One is Monosyllabic Chant. The other is Melismatic Chant. This is the development I'm talking about. All chant was monosyllabic to begin with, and that is that if you had a word like Alleluia, each syllable had a note, a different note, and it was monosyllabic. In other words, one note, one syllable in the chant. After a while, people got tired of this, and they found that if you put several notes on a syllable, for instance, if I sang Alleluia monosyllabic, I might sing Alleluia. But if I made it melismatic, then I may stretch out and sing Alleluia. And that's more beautiful. It sounds like birdsong. And so the people began to move toward melismatic chant. And it shows a development and a progression of the music we're talking about. So moving on, I talk about the people. And this is another thing where culture plays a big role. The government of the day, the standard government I shouldn't say of the day, for almost 10 centuries, was the feudal system. The feudal system had 3 classes: the nobility, the priest, and the peasants. The nobles, of course, sat at the top. The peasants sat at the bottom. Now, to make sure the nobles didn't abuse the peasants or the peasants rebel against the nobles, in other words, to keep society peaceful, the priest who sat in the middle, who had the control of the church and the ear of God, so to speak, they could tell the peasants, they say, God is not pleased if you do this. And they could tell the nobles, God is not pleased if you are mean to the peasants. So they kept them both in check. It was like somebody controlling the seesaw. And it worked. The only problem with the feudal system is it doesn't allow much advancement. The nobles and their families stay nobles. The peasants stay peasants. The only way they could rise up would be to join the army and hopefully win notice. But even then, they would never ascribe to lordship because they weren't noble. That's where the old idea of like the blood's different. Noble people have blue blood, red blood, that sort of thing. Crazy. But this did allow for a semblance of peace and stability, but it created a static society. It's not moving forward much. I talk more about monophonic and polyphonic music. And 2 people, Leonin and Periton, who were priests at Notre Dame, which is in Paris, by the way, and they were writing some music, and they were using polyphony, which is they would take a single song and they would put a line under it and 2 or 3 lines above it. And they didn't worry about harmony. They just had everybody singing stuff. Even sometimes the lines would be in different languages. So you see, it'd be really confusing. But they gave us the idea of polyphony. And along comes this other guy, Guillaume de Machaut. His name is William, from the province of Machaut. And he's the one who decided, hey, we can dress this up. And so even though Leon and Periton are the important polyphonic composers, it's Machaut who makes it sense. or gives a sense and makes it art. And he also did something else which is really important for music and the church. He decided that the worship service was, number one, it's too long, it's too boring, and the people are there because they have to be there, but they're not getting anything out of it. So he wrote what he calls the Mass, and it was a series of prayers, and they're logical. You open with a prayer praising God, and you ask God for stuff, and then you praise God, and you talk about Jesus saving the world, and then you close. And it flowed, and the people knew, even if they didn't understand Latin, they knew that if they were doing the Kyrie, they were praising God. If they did the Sanctus, they were asking God for something. If they did the, I forgot the other one. But anyway, if they did the part about Jesus, the Quitolis, Peccata Mundi section, they were talking about Jesus saving the world. And of course, they did Benedictus, which was ending. So it was logical, it made sense, and even people didn't understand the language could enjoy the music because it was better music, it was pretty. So we give Michaud credit for a major advancement. But think about this, from the 4th century all the way to Michaud, who was the 12th century, music is pretty boring. The secular music comes along and it sneaks in. Now secular, there's two words, sacred and secular. Sacred, of course, we know is about dealing with God and the church. Secular is anything that's not sacred. Today, if you listen to pop music, you're listening to secular music by the church standards. Where did it come from? Well, you can just about be sure of one thing, that it didn't start in Europe, it started in the Middle East. The Crusades were happening. In the 10th century, the Roman Church said, go and kill the infidel, the Saracen, the Moor, the Muslim. And so we had basically 5 real crusades, 6 if you count the Children's Crusade. These crusades sent soldiers who thought, number one, you fight in the crusade, you take the cross, you can be forgiven for sin. And in the foreign land, you could take the wealth. So a man could go on crusade and come back a rich man. A peasant could go and come back a knight or a lord based on money and what he had achieved. It was very tempting for a lot of people, particularly peasants, who saw an opportunity to elevate themselves. The church was blessing them, and even to the point where they said to kill an infidel is not a sin. So that murder is not bad. They made the big mistake was when they said, because we're the army of God, we'll never lose. Well, unfortunately, the first major battle they lost. And there was a lot of brutal, evil things went on. I wish I had time to talk about the Crusades, but they were just terrible for both sides. One thing I do want to clear up, though, because today in our world of political correctness, we look and I say the evil church, 5 crusades, they're so mean. Nobody ever asked how many crusades the Muslims made on Europe. It's like, well, the Muslims are just peaceful people over there doing math and writing pretty letters. They were just so nice. Well, they forget to point out that Islam banded together several different times, and you can trace at least 1,500 incursions into Europe by Muslim armies. One went as far as Paris, some went as far as Vienna. So let's be honest. 5 crusades compared to 1,500 invasions. They occupied Spain, the southern portion of Spain, all the way through the 15th century, and the influence is still there today. So rather than sit back and try to find a black and white history where one side's the good guys, one side's the bad guys, realize that both sides were involved in crusading and both sides are involved in atrocities, just to get that in the air, cleared up. But what happened with the Christian Crusaders is they came to the Middle East, they fought, they stayed for 100 years at one point. Jerusalem was under Christian control for 100 years. In the process, they began to adopt Muslim ways, Muslim style of dress, music, and they found rich music in the Middle East and instruments. They were also followed by a group of people as they passed through Hungary and Romania and places like that weren't that then but are today. They ran across the people of traveling nomadic entertainers. We call them gypsies. They were camp followers, and they came and followed the army. And when they went back, they followed the army back. You can see it as you look at the historical timeline, that there were no gypsies in Western Europe until after the Crusades began, and then they were everywhere. And there was also an influx of music. A lot of soldiers were killed. A lot of people saw their friends die. They saw that the church had lied to them about winning every battle, and that the church was there to do God's will when they're actually there encouraging everything from wholesale slaughter to cannibalism. And you have a lot of disillusioned nobility coming back. And they find that in any war, to escape the horrors of war and bury your sorrows, you do it through music and partying. And thus we have a group of people rise up. And you'll see them on slide 24, I think it is. Troubadours and trouvères, they were also called mini singers in Germany, with jongleurs. And it's like the mystery is, who were these people? Well, they had horses, they had money, they had power. So obviously they were probably lords, but they were running with gypsies and singing songs and playing weird instruments. So probably they were crusaders who had sort of taken off the cross and put on a secular lifestyle. Because the other clue that we get is when they would show up to a village, they weren't always forced to stay outside. A lot of times they were welcome into the palace as entertainers. And so you figure, well, these lords are known to be lords, so they can get into the rich crowd. With it, they spread this new music, which was a lot of love songs and lusty love songs. And they also had these entertainers, palm readers, jugglers, jongleurs, it's short for jugglers, acrobats, dancing girls. So they were like a traveling fair, a show. And with this, they become very popular. People love it. Now, why couldn't the church stop it? The only logical answer is because the church couldn't put the stop on these noblemen who were coming along with commoners. The thing they tried to happen all the time was nobles and peasants get together and get along was happening, and they couldn't stop it. It would be contrary to what they wanted, so they had to allow it. And thus you had a shifting of musical influence from the church back to the streets, to the towns, to the parties and stuff like that. So this is the beginning of secular music. I mention it again on the next slide. I give you a picture on slide 26 of your typical, one is the guy on the right is German, the guy on the left is French. But you see how outlandish their costumes are. They had gotten rid of the armor and the swords. They were about as far from looking militant as you get. That one guy looks like a flower arrangement in your slideshow. And the instrument they're carrying are lutes, simple, small, guitar-like instruments. The next slide, on slide 28, I mentioned a brief moment in history called the Ars Nova. It was in France and in Italy. They call this the new art, and it's a way of describing what the jongleurs and the troubadours and trouvères are doing. It happens at a time when the church is a little weaker in authority. People have more freedom in composing, more instruments are used, new various forms of rhythm coming from the Middle East of syncopation and things like that. And so they call this the new art. Now, the interesting thing about this new art, it's in the 14th century, which is the beginning of the Renaissance. And so a lot of people think that it's the new art is really literally the beginning of the Renaissance, and it wasn't a separate thing, but it seemed to have happened in a couple of places in particular, and then it spread. But the Ars Nova is the pivot from the old way of the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, into the new way, an age of enlightenment. Now, I do have a slide that, there's all the parts of the Mass on slide 28. And then I have some terms and questions and some instruments. But I'm going to leave this slide presentation and encourage you to look at the one on the Renaissance. Because like I said, I'm going to fuse these together. And in doing so, I'm going to pull questions from each of these pages. You'll notice at the end of every PowerPoint, there's terms and questions. I'm not going to give you all of that, but I am going to pull from each one. Now, as usual, before you go screaming and crying, say, this is too much. remember you've got the test in your hand and you've got the answers available to you. So it's a matter not of memorizing, but of reading, seeking and reading. That's why the tests are considered rather easy. But let's go to the Renaissance. Now, the first slide in the Renaissance PowerPoint is about the progression of music through the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And I go over again about how we go from monophonic to monosyllabic to melismatic, go from a drone for simple harmony to polyphony for complex harmony, instruments, and then the mass, and then the ars nova. That is the musical evolution throughout the Dark Ages. Now, what about Renaissance? Renaissance, and I've got a whole list of things on one page that I'm going to go over each one, but I'm going to do it sort of rapidly because, again, I want you to focus on the music. But Renaissance itself means rebirth. People always learn that, but they never ask the important question, a rebirth of what? You see, you can rebirth something, but you need to give it a name. What this was a rebirth of a cultural atmosphere within the time of all these nations, and it was the same. Each country had its different culture, you might say, but each one was doing the same thing, just in their way. But what are they doing? They're looking to the past, and they look to their immediate past. They think, we don't want to do the Dark Ages again. That wasn't fun. So they go back and they say, well, we don't want to do Rome again because it was bloody and mean. They go back and they see these beautiful cities and temples that are still standing, and they say, who built this? They say, oh, the Greeks did that. And look what they did. They had pots with beautiful paintings, and they had plays, and they had songs, and they had instruments. This was a golden age of Greece. Now, I didn't want to burst their bubble and tell them it only lasts them for a brief while, but they go back and they try to do everything the Greeks had done as far as architecture, as far as art, music, and even attempts at government. But that's what they're rebirthing. They're rebirthing the Greek age. And you're going to see that a couple of times pop up. It was a social reaction, you might say, to the Middle Ages. I mentioned that on the next slide. The important thing, too, was the Greeks were sailors, and they were all over the Mediterranean. So they were inspiring to think these guys were explorers. And look what happened. After you go past this architectural thing, there's a page of Age of Exploration. And this is the age when people really get out of the Mediterranean Sea. I list several well-known people. You may not know them by their faces there, but the only one that probably doesn't belong on here, and yet in a way does, is the first one, the guy up in the left on the upper right-hand corner. That's Marco Polo. Now, he was alive in the 12th and 13th century. So you think, well, what's he doing in the Renaissance? He wasn't in the Renaissance, but he gave a spark to the Renaissance because of his travels. And you know the story, Marco Polo goes to China, brings back all this great stuff, and now there is this desire for Chinese goods. But the only way to do it was to cross over into the Suez, what is now the Red Sea. Well, they didn't have a Suez Canal, but cross over, get into the Red Sea, and sail around the tip of Saudi Arabia. But the problem is, at the bottom of Saudi Arabia, it's a beehive of pirates. Remember the story of Sinbad? That's where Sinbad, the pirate, lived. And so it was dangerous, and it was highly unlikely to get through there. So you had to go across land. Well, that's just bad. Go through Persia and Afghanistan. We know how that is. To get to India, and it's hard to, once you get to India, to get to China, you have to go through the Tibetan mountains, the Himalayas. That's just near impossible. If you go north, you have to go through the Gobi Desert, which is almost impossible. So it's hard to get there. India was close enough because they could trade. Chinese came to India and traded with them. But Westerners were looking for a route. Marco Polo got there. It took him forever. About didn't get back. So they said, that's not working. So they said, what if we go down to the south below Africa? We won't sail off the edge of the world. We can go that way. Well, the first one to try it, a guy named Bartolome Diaz, he only got about halfway, and he turned around and came back. When he got to the southern part of Africa below the equator, he realized the currents were swapping, going the wrong way, got confused. But he mapped it, and he also noted it. He came back, and he opened a school for navigators in Portugal. And most of the great navigators went to Diaz's school and they learned about this stuff. We know the guy down on the left-hand corner in the slide is Vasco da Gama. Uh, Vasco da Gama gets credit for circumnavigating that area around the southern tip of Africa. And then you have Ferdinand Magellan. But before I jump ahead of myself, we of course have to talk about Christopher Columbus. I'm going back to him because Columbus is the one who opened the seaway west. And, well, we know the story. He came to the Indies, which he thought was India, and he really found the Caribbean. People say he found America, but the truth is he never landed in America or North America. He landed in the islands. So should he get all that credit? That's been the big debate. But anyway, he thought he had gotten to India, and it took a while for they figured out he hadn't. But others went there, and they found lots of good stuff. Now, these other guys, like Magellan and Da Gama, they're trying to get to India, and they sail around the southern tip. I think it was Magellan, the guy who circumnavigated the globe through the Pacific, which was pretty incredible. Unfortunately, he died in the Philippines, but they took his body home and buried him, so he gets credit. But think about how the world changed during this period. Instantly, overnight, well, in a few months, a whole new continent is discovered, whole new races of people, food, customs, and all that's brought back to Europe. It's sort of like the internet being invented and everybody getting it overnight. Now you've got access to all kinds of new information. It changed the world, quite frankly. The rest of the world was slow. The Far East, they didn't sort of have that immediate change because they were the object of where everybody's trying to get to. They weren't trying to get anywhere. We know now that there were some interesting travels, such as there's been evidence of Chinese ships in South America and Chinese language and even Japanese in Peru. So a lot of stuff was going on, but the Europeans are the ones who really made a big deal out of it. And we give credit to Columbus for starting the whole rush. But this exploration opens the minds of the people. It challenges the church authority. And that's why the church didn't like the Renaissance, because now the church has said the world is flat. They proved that they were wrong about that. And so there's a lot of argument there. The next slide talks about the thought, because that's the other thing. With this new age of thinking, there's a new philosophy takes control. It's called humanism. Now, this is not to be confused with today's secular humanism. This humanism was coinciding with God, but it was expanding the role of man in God's eyes. You basically, and I think I say here, it's simply stated, was a focus on man's accomplishments as given by God. God empowers man to discover these things. So there was not a wholesale rejection of God. And so the church still has some power and authority, and it also is monitoring things like music and art again. But humanism, the good side of it, of this humanism, was a general concern for all people. They wanted to see that God blesses all of us. And remember, God is still central in this style of humanism. The Renaissance man, the noble, was someone who no longer thought just of himself, but he thought about his responsibility to others. And the Renaissance man was someone who could sing, play instruments, fight with a sword, write a poem, great at philosophy, faithful to the church. He was the all in all. We call it the jack of all trades. So today, if someone calls you a Renaissance man, that's really quite a compliment. The other big thing, I mentioned the internet. They had their internet explosion. It just wasn't electronic. It was the Gutenberg Press. When the Gutenberg Press came out, reading was low on the totem pole of interest. Only the nobles, the lords, some businessmen. But with the press, two things happen. More people are clamoring for education and wanting to learn how to read. And with that, we see it affecting not only the nobles, but men who wanted to have business now needed to know how to read and write and keep ledgers. The more they could do it, the more business there were, and we see the development of commerce. Empires and governments have always had one common thing, and that was they wanted to take money legally from the people to finance their adventures, taxes. And now they find that if there's a guy who's building, I don't know, furniture, and he's good at it, he makes a lot of money, then we can get more taxes. So they encouraged it. And they also encouraged that he train others. And we have the development what's known as the guild system. You probably remember that from social studies, where people are learning to do these skills and they become specialized skills. Now, the lords and the nobles, the people who levy the taxes, say, this isn't bad. This is actually good. Education is good. Business is good because we can level taxes and they make money and we make money. Everybody's happy. It was a bustling time of making money, and everything became a money-making deal. The sad thing about Gutenberg, he printed a Bible and some other stuff, but he didn't charge for them. He eventually sold his printing press to a Frenchman who printed books and sold them. And then Gutenberg had to buy back his own press, thinking he could stop this guy from doing it. He'd make the money, but he forgot the guy knew how to build his own now. And Gutenberg could have built his own, but it was all about commerce. And commerce really, you say, money makes the world go round. In a way it does, because people began to travel all over the world to get more stuff that they could sell, or to find gold, such as in Middle America, where they could get rich. But this Gutenberg Press becomes the internet of their day, because now, instead of waiting a month for a monk to write a Bible, you can print one in a week. Everybody gets one in their hand. It got pretty dangerous, though, because pretty soon the church was afraid people would not need the church. They'd read the Bible on their own. So for a while, they said you can't have a Bible. And they killed people for actually having a Bible. I want to talk a little bit about art trends here, because this is important. A guy named Filippo Brunelleschi, he's walking around a building drawing a picture. He noticed that the wall he's looking at is taller than the one on either side. So he goes to that side and looks, oh, wait, now this wall is taller than the one I was just at. And he figures out there's such a thing as perspective. Further something is away, the smaller it looks. You look at a tree that's 100 yards away and it's only a foot tall. You get to it, it's 20 feet tall. He began to think about this in painting, because the church had not encouraged this. There was perspective in the Middle Ages, but the church discouraged artists from doing reality. They said, you're trying to be God. So everything was one perspective. Brunelleschi breaks through that and says, art should reflect reality. I'm not God trying to create the world. I'm just trying to reflect God's creation. And now we have this. Oh, matter of fact, on the next slide, that baptistry or that building is what Brunelleschi was looking at when he discovered the idea of real perspective. And we see this example on the next slide of Middle Age art, flat, people are as tall as buildings, and then modern art or Renaissance art, where you see a focal point in the distance, that sort of thing. On the next slide, that's slide 11, I'll give you an example of Botticelli's Birth of the Venus. And again, it's art imitating life, because this is considered beauty. Today, we would say that girl's fat. But in this day, a little chubby woman was considered beautiful, changing customs. Also, the meeker she was, the better. The men, of course, kept their Brad Pitt look, because that's what a warrior looked like. But we see the customs here, and the art is reflective of reality, even though it's using a Greek mythological idea. I want to introduce two guys here, Michelangelo, of course, and if you know anything about Michelangelo, he's famous for painting the Sistine Chapel. But he was also a bit of a rebel. If you read his biography, you'll find that he and the Pope were at odds. He didn't want to paint the Sistine Chapel. He saw himself as a sculptor, not a painter. But he was more or less forced into it, paid very little. And because of that, there's some interesting things that are just now coming to light. For instance, if you look up at the top of the ceiling, you see God imparting life to man. Michelangelo puts God over here with the heavenly host, and he puts man to the left, and the image reflects that man is sort of lazy and worthless, that God has to do all the work. Man can't even hold his arm up without propping it up, and then it's weak at the wrist. That's a slap at humanity because it's fallen under the church. But the other thing, and the big question is, what is God in? That big purple thing. And people said, oh, it's a pomegranate, because that was the apple in Eden. And the heavenly host, a bunch of little cherubs and stuff like that. What's interesting is there was a tour in Rome several years back, and they asked the question, they said, what is God in this picture? And the guy said, it's not a picture of what he's in, it's a picture of God is in a brain. And it was a brain surgeon who said, that's got all the parts of the brain, the pituitary gland, the spinal cord, all this stuff. And he said, it's basically reflecting that God is in the mind of men. Now that's pretty sacrilegious, but the question is, did Michelangelo do that on purpose? Was he sending a message to the church to say he didn't really believe that God existed other than in the minds of men? You see another picture there, and I'll zoom into that one. This is a guy who's hanging upside down, but people kept noticing something on his neck in the picture. And if you don't have the slide presentation up, you're going to miss out on this. But he's got this weird thing under his neck. People said, oh, that's a cancer, it's a goiter, it's all kinds of stuff. Brain surgeon again said, actually, no, that's part of the underside of the brain again, that man and the brain go together. We'll never know if Michelangelo was sending a coded message of disdain toward the church, or if maybe that was just something he painted and it looked weird. But like I said, he saw himself as a sculptor. And so today, if you ever see any of these, and I've got 3 examples of his sculpture, it's incredible. After that, the other guy, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo and Da Vinci were the artists of the Renaissance. And I'm talking about visual art. Oddly enough, we see Da Vinci and we see the Mona Lisa, we see the Last Supper, but what he was best known for was his inventions. And when he lived in Milan, he was a weapons designer, and he was designing weapons because they were at war, I think, with Florence and Vienna at one point. Venice at one point. And so here's some of those designs on the next slide, which is slide 19. You'll see he designed a rough idea of a helicopter, which people laughed at, but all that's missing was a powerful enough engine, and the Air Force Academy built this and put an engine on it. It actually worked. It wasn't stable enough to fly, but it did lift people off the ground. He has an idea for a tank, which was an ox cart with oxen inside it, covered over, and various guns sticking out the portals that could rotate. And as the cart walked along, it worked and was used. He has imagery for a multi-firing rifle, which was a precursor to the Gatling gun, precursor to the machine gun. And then, of course, his famous wings of man, which the wing part didn't work because man can't flap his wings as strong as a bird, but the gliding part didn't work. So here's a guy who sees things totally different. People said maybe he was an alien or something. But when he wasn't doing this, he was painting pictures. I do want to go back and say one other thing. Mona Lisa, there's a master's of art student, a grad student, who was studying the Mona Lisa, and she did a retrograde. She flipped it the other way and changed it, and turns out that face of the Mona Lisa, which has always been the enigmatic smile, you overlay the self-portrait of Da Vinci, and he's looking to the right instead of the left, and if you flip her to the right, they fit almost perfectly. So some people said that Leonardo painted the Mona Lisa as himself as a woman, just so he could hide his ego. And that's why Mona Lisa never considered that beautiful. Well, it could be because she's an old guy. That opens up a whole can of worms. But these people did stuff like this and it reveals to us that they were thinking on a totally different level. The church had sort of stepped back, and the mind of man is free to roam. Part of it is because this guy was not a Renaissance man per se. He was after, but his thinking comes out of the Renaissance as people are beginning to wonder about the nature of life and philosophy and reality. It culminates with this guy who was living in the 15th century when he says, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And that is a purely Renaissance idea, and Rene Descartes is the one who gave it. But he was important. Now, having said all that, let's get back to the church, because this is where the music is really happening. But this right here, the Protestant Reformation, and hear me clearly, this brought the Renaissance to a screeching halt. The people were excited, artistic, innovative, entrepreneurial. Everybody was just going great guns. Now, it did, by the way, I should say this, all of this money floating around did lead to war, because one city-state, not countries, but city-states, in Italy in particular, if they see somebody with a lot of money and they want more money, they, instead of trading with them, sometimes they would take it from them, trying to build up their own little empire city. So there was a lot of war. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't all beautiful days. But the church still was there. But the church made a fatal mistake because it tried to make some money too. One of the popes in particular was looking to refurbish buildings in Rome and make some money. And so he was looking for ways to raise funds. And he took ideas from the priest. And one young priest in Germany, or actually around Eisenach, he said, what if we let people pay for an absolution of sin? We could sell them forgiveness. And that was called absolution. You go in to give the priest money, and he says, I absolve you of the sin and the guilt. And the Pope said, hey, I like this. So they began to allow people to pay for sin. Well, that's not great for peasants, but it's great for nobles. They can commit sin and pay for it. And so it made them pretty happy. Problem, this guy, Martin Luther, was a young minister there in Eisenach. And he said, this isn't right. He sent a letter to the Pope. He said, no, forgiveness, salvation, the Bible clearly says it's a free gift. We can't charge these people to be forgiven for sin. We can ask them to do acts of contrition or something like that, and prayers for forgiveness. That's the whole Our Father and Hail Mary stuff when they go to confession, but we can't take money. They can't buy their way into heaven. Well, the Pope didn't like that idea. Long story short, they sent people to arrest him. The local dukes and the local lords said, or barons said, we like this idea. We're tired of sending money to Rome. And so they said, you're not going to take our preacher. Well, they wouldn't let him preach. And this is where you've heard of the famous 95 Theses. He nailed these sermons up on the church door because he couldn't preach them, so he wrote them and put them up so people could read them. Long story short, they sent more troops, and then the barons sent troops, and suddenly you have a war. And the war was considered the Protestant Reformation. The group of people that were protesting the Catholic Church were trying to reform the church. They weren't trying to start a new church. They were trying to reform the old one because they were Catholics. They considered themselves Catholics. He was a priest. Instead, the church says, no, we're going to kick you out because you're disobeying the Pope. And so you had a lot of excommunication, but you also had a lot of blood, a lot of people getting killed. What it evolved into was basically, as they were fighting, remember I told you about those Muslims that came to Vienna? One of the Muslim armies made it all the way to Vienna, and they besieged the city before the rest of these people who were fighting said, wait a minute, we need to stop fighting and look, because the Muslims are going to overrun us as we fight. And so they called a truce, and they went to the Muslims. A Polish prince broke the siege of Vienna, and they chased the Muslims away. And after that, rather than go back to fighting, they had a truce. And essentially you had Italy, part of France and Spain stayed Catholic, part of France, eventually Britain and Germany would go Protestant. And places like Belgium were sort of split down the middle. And that's the way it's been ever since the 14th century. The sad news is it did stop the Renaissance, but the spirit of the Renaissance will keep going. Now, let's talk about Renaissance music. As I said, that's what's really important. Because of this split, we see one of the most important things that developed, and that is the ideas of music. Now, you're just going to see here that word or text painting was one of the main compositional traits. And what that is they wrote lyrics about mythical things or heavenly things. And then in the music, they tried their best to portray what that was being said in the lyrics in the music. And I have an example for you to listen to that I'll post called As Vesta Was Descending. And it's about a goddess coming from Mount Olympus. And whenever she says she's coming down, the music goes down. And it says when someone else is going up, the music goes up. If one person is singing, they'll say it's one person and it's a solo. If it's 2 by 2, it's 2 people. And then it's all together, it's the whole chorus. Whatever's being said is being done in the music. It's very interesting, and it makes for some interesting listening and analyzing. A lot of music was still a cappella, but that's going to change in the Renaissance as they get more and more stuff, instruments. But the two styles, I'll show you some composers. I really just want you to know their names. I'm not going to talk about them a lot. I do want to focus on sacred and secular music because it was pretty simple. In the world of vocal music, you had sacred music, which was called a French motet, or just a motet. It was a vocal form, had 4 more lines, and the leading composer of the day was a guy named Josquin des Prez. Now, I've got a sample of his Ave Maria that you can listen to. And then you still have the Mass, which is being written, oddly enough, not only by the Catholics, but the Protestants are using the Mass, and they're writing their music in the local language. Some are still using Latin, such as the Episcopalians. Then the other form of music is secular music, which is called a madrigal. Now, the simple thing about a madrigal and motet are musically, they're almost exactly the same. They use the same techniques and compositional style. They even use word painting. The difference is the motet is always about something sacred. The madrigal is always about something secular. So if the motet's singing about the love of Mary and the love of God, the madrigal is singing about the love of the girl down the street and how pretty she is. You have a great Italian influence, and there's a legend, or I should say anecdotal story, that an Italian ship wrecked off the English coast, and a whole book of lyrics landed there, and the English found it. They loved the poetry, and they started making madrigals, and they became the leading madrigal writers. But the leading madrigal writer of the English was a guy named Thomas Weeks. He's the guy who wrote As Vesta Was Descending. So here you have the secular and sacred music. And a picture of Josquin des Prez and Thomas Weeks. Interestingly enough, des Prez wrote religious music, and they have a portrait. Weeks wrote secular music, and he ends up a stained glass window in a church. Go figure. And then you come to the end. There's more terms and some questions. Now, I'm going to post these 2 PowerPoints and some musical examples from each. So what you will think is lesson 4, I'm actually taking lessons 6 and 7, mashing them together. So if you see lesson 6 or lesson 7, don't panic. Just do them together. And there will be a test. It will not be all of this stuff, but I'm going to choose certain words and certain questions from both PowerPoints. And I have music samples, and that will be posted hopefully today, and you'll be able to get at it. But this is only for the 8 weeks class, by the way. The 16-week class, I've given them some other torturous duty to do. But you can get started on that. And we're also going to, I may post the next historical period. This one may take you a little bit longer, but I want you to be able to work ahead if you're a fast worker. So I may post the Baroque information as well. But that's enough for today. Enjoy.